a young woman disappears near Stanford University. A few days later, her body is found in the hills near the campus. Her own scarf is wrapped tightly around her neck. A year later, there is another death. A 21-year-old woman is abused and strangled near the campus. The police are baffled. There is no trace of the perpetrator or perpetrators. The cases remain unsolved for decades. No one suspects that the perpetrator has been living among them for a long time. A seemingly harmless family man and scout leader who secretly leads a dark double life. It's June 8, 1963, and Margaret L. Williams is probably quite excited. That evening, Margaret's high school is hosting a disco. Margaret's high school is both totally normal and quite unusual. Her school is not located in her home country, the United States, but in the middle of Germany. More precisely, in Bad Kreuznach in Rhineland-Palatinate. Her father has been stationed there for some time as a chaplain for the soldiers. For Margaret and her classmates, the disco that evening is likely to be a pretty big deal. We probably all remember our first school parties. Margaret Williams will not survive hers. The day after the school disco, Margaret's body is found on the baseball field next to the school. She is naked, and her body shows signs of severe physical and sexual violence. She has also been strangled, which is probably what ultimately led to her death. A military base should be the safest place on Earth. For Margaret, however, it is the place where she was killed. It doesn't take long for the perpetrator to be found. Witness statements soon lead the police to an 18-year-old boy. Several witnesses have stated that they last saw Margaret with John, who is 2 years older. Just like Margaret's family, John's father also serves in the U.S. military and has been stationed in Bad Kreuznach for some time. Previously, the family, which consists of John, his parents, and his 3 siblings, also lived in Hawaii, Japan, and the U.S. state of North Carolina. In an interview, John confessed to abusing Margaret. He said he had never noticed Margaret before, but when she got out of his car that evening, she caught his eye. The two then went for a walk to get to know each other. John claims he had no other intentions at first. However, John probably deliberately led her away from the school, first to a park bench, then to a playground. He may have wanted to make out with her a little, but it quickly escalated, even though Margaret told him several times that she wanted to go home and that he should stop. John admits that this only aroused him even more. Margaret apparently started talking loudly and calling for help, whereupon John hit her in the throat. When Margaret started crying, he punched her in the face. Then he put his jacket over her head and pressed down with both hands. He pressed one hand over her mouth and the other over her throat. John admits that Margaret lost consciousness. She was no longer moving, but John believes she was still breathing. So he continued. John emphasizes that he did not murder Margaret, or, as he himself put it during the interrogation, "It didn't even occur to me that I might have killed her. I just wanted to knock her out." Although there is no direct evidence of John's intent to murder, he is ultimately charged with abuse resulting in death. However, as he is only 18 years old, he is considered a juvenile offender under West German criminal law. On July 13, 1964, he is sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, he does not serve the entire sentence. Due to a favorable social prognosis and good behavior, John is released from prison after 5 years and 9 months. The only condition is that he must follow his parents back to the U.S., where the Getreu family has since resettled. There, John Getreu is able to lead a normal life on probation starting in 1969. However, he does not do so. And the social prognosis of the West German officials? It turns out to be fatally wrong. Stanford University in California is one of the most prestigious universities in the country. Those who are accepted and able to study there are the envy of many ambitious people. This is perhaps even more true for Janet Taylor. The 21-year-old is not only a student at Stanford, but also the daughter of a campus legend. Her father, Chuck Taylor, had been the college's highly successful football coach for many years. But on March 24, 1974, the Taylor family's fairy tale story with Stanford University came to a gruesome end. On that day, the body of 21-year-old Janet was found. A truck driver discovered the dead student on the side of a highway in San Mateo County. Just a few hours earlier, Janet had left a friend's house in Palo Alto to drive home. She wanted to hitchhike home to La Honda, but was murdered on the way. This is not the first murder of this kind on the campus of the prestigious university. Just 1 year earlier, a student of the same age named Leslie Perloff was found dead. An investigator immediately noticed the similarities between the two murders. Just like Janet, Leslie had started her journey home in Palo Alto. The young woman worked in the legal department of a library there. Leslie was strangled with a floral scarf. Her body was found under an old maple tree. Her car was parked a short distance away on Old Page Mill Road. Apparently, the young woman was attacked and murdered on her way home. In addition, Leslie and Janet were both students at Stanford University, where they were still on campus on the day of their respective murders. Both were strangled, and sexual motives were apparent in both cases. The investigator notices the parallels between the two murders and makes a note in a file. And then nothing happens for a very long time. The murders of Janet and Leslie are filed away as cold cases. Until 2018, more than 30 years later, when a company gets involved in the investigation. Parabon Nanolabs supports the investigation of criminal cases nationwide by offering DNA phenotyping. Male DNA was found under Leslie's fingernails at the time. With the new possibilities offered by DNA research, it is now also apparent that the same DNA was found on Janet Taylor's underwear. It is therefore clear that both women were murdered by the same perpetrator. With just one correct DNA trace, 2 decades-old murder cases could be solved at once. Parabon extracts something like a genetic data set from this and compares it with publicly accessible DNA databases, where users have voluntarily uploaded their genetic data for genealogical research. These can be platforms such as Ancestry. If even one genetic relative of the perpetrator has registered their DNA there, a kind of genetic family tree can be created. This often allows the identity of a perpetrator to be traced back to individuals. Incidentally, forensic genealogy is not permitted in some countries, but it is in the United States. And there is also a match for Leslie Perloff's killer. A cousin of John Getreu has stored his DNA in such a database. And when the police look at John Getreu's background, it is quite obvious that these two murders fit his criminal profile. On the one hand, there is the murder in Bad Kreuznach, and on the other hand, John committed a crime there just 6 years after returning to the US. In 1975, he was convicted in California for molesting a minor. He was sentenced to just 6 months in prison, of which he only had to serve 1. Although he even confessed to the crime, his punishment was only 1 month in prison and a fine of $200. What is particularly shocking is that his victim was a Girl Scout, and John himself led a Boy Scout troop at the time of the crime. And although he had already been convicted of murder in Germany, he was allowed to continue working with minors in the United States. And even though he was not the girl's group leader, he came into contact with her through his work. At that point, he had already committed the 2 murders of Janet and Leslie. He was able to get away with both crimes for the time being. After serving his sentence, John Getreu did not appear on the police radar again until 2018. In 1970, a year after returning to the United States, he married his first wife and lived in Palo Alto for some time. He worked for a time as a laboratory technician at a hospital called Mills Hospital. Later, he also worked at Stanford Hospital, close to the university. After separating from his first wife, he married a second time in 1978 and moved with her to Ohio. Over the next few years, he bought a house in California and later presumably several plots of land. In 2003, his second wife died of cancer. In 2008, John married his third wife. John Getreu is the father of several children and is described by neighbors as a normal, nice guy. In reality, he was not only responsible for the death of Margaret Williams in Germany, but also a serial killer. He was not arrested until John Getreu is the father of several children and is described by neighbors as a normal, nice guy. In reality, he was not only responsible for the death of Margaret Williams in Germany, but also a serial killer. He was not arrested until decades after his crimes. Until then, he was able to lead a normal life. After tracking down John Getreu, the officers have a concrete chain of evidence. However, what is still missing is an absolute DNA match. Until then, they have the DNA of his cousin, which points in John's direction, but this is not yet confirmation. Therefore, the investigators must obtain a DNA sample from John himself. This can be done in very simple ways. For example, by fishing something out of the suspect's household trash and taking DNA traces from it. This happened most recently in 2013 in New York to convict serial killer Rex Heuermann, who is now also known as the Gilgo Beach serial killer. A police officer had been watching him and saw him throw a pizza box into a trash can. The undercover police officer took the box and had the DNA traces analyzed. And that's how Rex was finally arrested. It is not known exactly how the police obtained John Getreu's DNA in his case. But the fact is that they got his DNA and that it was exactly the same DNA as that found on the bodies of Leslie Perloff and Janet Taylor. This proves that John Getreu is a serial killer, and his arrest is just as spectacular. An undercover policewoman rings John Getreu's doorbell. She pretends that she has accidentally crashed into John's car in his driveway and asks him to take a look and replace everything for the insurance company if necessary. John falls for the trick and follows the policewoman.
I was turning around in your driveway and I accidentally hit your car.
Which one?
The one parked in the driveway. Do you want to maybe take a look to see if we should exchange insurance information?
Take a peek.
Oh man, I'm so sorry. So embarrassing.
Sure, something. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead. Hands behind your back. Wait in the car. Go ahead and face the car.
What? What's this?
We'll talk to you in a minute. Anybody else in the house?
No, my wife's at work.
Instead of his wrecked car, however, handcuffs await John Getreu at the end of his driveway. Now over 70 years old, he remains calm during his arrest. He doesn't even ask why he is being arrested. He only asks the officers to close his front door so that his dogs don't run away. As he sits in the police car in handcuffs, he even compliments the officer on the trap they set to arrest him. Nevertheless, John Getreu does not seem willing to give up. When he is interrogated, he not only claims to have no idea what he is doing, but also that he is completely innocent. When the police officer asks him if he has ever been arrested before, John says no. Remember, this is the same man who was sentenced to 10 years for abuse resulting in death and 6 months for abuse. John Getreu lies to the officer's face. And this despite the fact that it should be obvious that the police officer has access to his police file. Whether this is simply negligence or arrogance, we can only guess. Whatever it is, It will cause Getreu to shoot himself in the foot in the next few minutes. Even when the officer hints that he knows about the murder of Margaret in West Germany, John pretends to be innocent. He only talks about accusations against himself. He doesn't mention that he was convicted and admitted to the crime himself. In the case of the Girl Scout, he also only talks about being accused and questioned. When asked directly if he was in prison for that, he says, "Not that I know of." That's a totally bizarre answer anyway. After all, John really was in prison for that, even if only for a month. The police officer questioning John then takes a slightly different tack. He shows John a photo of the murdered Leslie and asks if John would recognize her. He says no, but also says that Leslie looks cute, like she's about 18 years old, a Stanford student. However, the officer conducting the interrogation has not mentioned that Leslie studied at Stanford University. At this point, the police officer realizes that he almost has John where he wants him. He keeps asking John over and over again if he has ever thought about murdering someone, abusing someone, and so on. John denies everything, shakes his head, and says he knows nothing about this person or these two people. And that's exactly where the crux of the matter lies. Because the police officer only wanted to question John about Leslie Perloff that day. The Janet Taylor case wasn't even on the table yet. But now John suddenly starts talking about two people who have been murdered. He pretends that it was just a misunderstanding, but John clearly realizes that he has let something slip. He can no longer withstand the pressure of the interrogation. Again and again, telltale fragments of sentences slip out. For example, when the police officer says, "You're guilty, and you knew this day would come." John replies, "Yes, I knew. But why did it take so damn long?" At the end, he says that without his lawyer, he won't say anything more. He doesn't have to. The police have heard enough. After John is arrested, his photo is naturally published in the press. And when a woman named Sharon sees a picture of John in the newspaper, a chill runs down her spine. She picks up her phone and dials the number of the newspaper's editorial office. She says she's been searching for the face that now adorns the front page for more than 50 years. The face of John Getreu. She claims that John attacked and strangled her back then. The assault lasted several hours. That's why Sharon still remembers very well the eyes of her attacker, which she recognizes in John's face that day. Sharon describes her encounter with John and the crime against her son. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Sharon is a young woman living in Simi Valley near Hollywood. She regularly attends events for young people at her local church. When Sharon is 19, she meets a man at one of these events. The man asks her out on a date. Sharon feels a little uncomfortable because the man is in his mid-20s and therefore a little older than her. She hesitates, but two older female church employees who have been watching the situation persuade her to accept the invitation. To represent Christ and meet people, as the older women say. So Sharon hesitantly gets into the car of the man who wants to take her to a cafe. Instead, however, he drives into the Hollywood Hills and parks the car in a remote spot. Then he suddenly starts strangling Sharon. And he did this repeatedly for hours. He strangled her, let her go so she could catch her breath, and then strangled her again. The man told her he was acting on God's orders. He told Sharon he had to kill her. God had instructed him to kill beautiful women who were a temptation to his Christian brothers. Only when the sun rose again did he let her go. Sharon says she believes she only survived because she remained calm. She was afraid that showing her fear would only provoke the perpetrator further. So she remained as quiet as possible until she had the chance to jump out of the car. The perpetrator then simply drove away. And now, 50 years later, Sharon believes she has recognized the perpetrator. Sharon also discusses the whole thing with the police to assist with the investigation. However, there is not enough evidence to press charges in this case. Unfortunately, in her case, there is only her statement. Leslie Perloff and Janet Taylor, on the other hand, have DNA evidence and John's more than incriminating police interrogation. John Getreu is charged separately for both sexual murders. Margaret Williams' brother also appears during the court proceedings. Margaret's brother is now well over 70 and still remembers how terrible the time after the crime against his sister was for the Williams family. Parts of the police files from that time are also read out again. This brings to light even more extensive information that makes the crime against the girl seem even more gruesome. Among other things, it is described how John simply left Margaret lying there, even though she was obviously at least unconscious. John testified at the time that he had seen car lights from a nearby street and had therefore run home. Later, he left again, pretending to take the family dog for a walk. In reality, he wanted to check if Margaret had regained consciousness. She had not. But even when John saw the girl lying dead in the field, he did nothing. He simply went home and waited for the matter to blow over. It seems as if John basically repeated his modus operandi in the Janet Taylor and Leslie Perloff cases. Due to his age, John appears in court in a wheelchair. Perhaps his physical condition is also the reason why he ultimately no longer denies the crimes. He pleads guilty to both the murder of Leslie Perloff and the murder of Janet Taylor. In both cases, he receives a life sentence without the possibility of parole. After his conviction, John is even charged with a fourth murder. At an unspecified time, a girl named Teresa Smith was found dead in Newark, Ohio. During a press conference in 2022, an investigative journalist announces that John Getreu is also responsible for this crime. Unfortunately, few details are given. Only that John is said to have lived 2 blocks away from Teresa at the time. The journalist has done reputable work in the past and has also cooperated with the police. However, no charges are ever brought against John in the Teresa Smith case. On September 22, 2023, John Getreu dies at the age of 79. He therefore only spent about 5 years in prison for the murders of Leslie and Janet. He was able to live as a free man for decades. It was only in the last years of his life that the police caught up with him. It is unclear whether John is responsible for any other crimes, but it seems likely. After all, his last known crime was committed in 1975. Before that, he committed at least 4 crimes within 12 years. 3 of them were murders. It would be very unusual for a perpetrator like John to simply stop after something like that. Many cold cases were re-examined, and John's DNA was compared with evidence that had been secured, but this is only possible in cases that were reported to the police. In cases of abuse in particular, it is quite possible that victims did not report the crimes to the police, especially since it was even more stigmatized back then than it is today. At least the murders of Leslie and Janet were solved. And at least John was convicted and didn't live his whole life without facing the consequences of his crimes. Unlike in the case of Manfred Seal. If you're interested in the case, just check out the info box. I'll link it there. And that brings us to the end of today's video. Feel free to write your thoughts on the case in the comments. Otherwise, there's not much more to say. I wish you a good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you're watching the video, and hope to see you again in the next video. Until then, ciao everyone.